All right, welcome everyone. It's nice to see you all. This is such a wonderful group. I know so many of you and really looking forward to meeting those of you I haven't already. I see some really senior students who know this topic back to front, and so I'm really honored that you're here listening to it with me, and hope that you can contribute any gaps that you see me making. And those newer folks, please make sure that you jump in if I seem to be skipping some steps. But before we start, let's go ahead and start by setting our motivation. So if you feel comfortable doing the refuge and bodhicitta prayer and the four immeasurable thoughts, you can do it along with me. Otherwise, just set an intention that's really altruistic, that is thinking to benefit others. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from desire for friends and hatred for enemies. Taking a moment with those four immeasurable thoughts, connecting with love, compassion, joy, and equanimity. And then refuge in bodhicitta. Sangye chudon sogi chunam la janchu padu dani kapsuchi dagi chunyangi pe sonamgi rola penjir sangye drupa sho sangye chudon sogi chunam la janchu padu dani kapsuchi dagi chunyangi pe sonamgi Rola penchir sangye drupa sho sangye chudam sugi chunam la janchu paru dani kapsuchi dagi chunyengi pe sonamgi rola penchir sangye drupa sho. Connecting with refuge, connecting with bodhicitta, the mind of enlightenment. Okay. So we're going to start this session with some general things to get us all on the same page, and then hopefully we can get right into the nitty-gritty and the specifics of how the mind functions and what we do with that information. So this first part will be kind of general knowledge just to get us all kind of clarified on the Buddhist worldview, and also to see where you guys are at with your perspective on what is the mind and what is our relationship to it as an individual. So we're just going to start with some of that bits and pieces and see how we go. So the first very basic question is the mind the brain? Is the mind the brain? Meaning, is the mind material or immaterial? And I think that when we sit with it, we already probably know, people in this group, what the Buddhist worldview would say. But before we just skip to it, I think it's good for us to really be with our experience. You know, there's a lot of conversations lately about somatic therapies and polyvagal understandings of the way the brain and the nervous system work. There's all sorts of conversations about the mechanisms that create the self, nature, and nurture. And we have some visceral lived experience of a body-mind connection. And is the mind the brain, or is it something additional? And you're just sitting with it and you're asking yourself, how do these functions occur? How is experience felt? Where does it all come from? You know, it's an interesting question, and probably what led a lot of us to the spiritual path in the first place is to really consider these questions and wonder a little bit about what is it that goes from life to life? Does anything go from life to life? Where did consciousness come from at birth? What happens to it at death? Is it just something to do with electricity and energy coming together with physical matter? What is it exactly that's happening? And these are the deep questions that have answers, but not the sort of answers we're going to be able to know for certain as beginners, because we're going to need to really work on logic, reasoning, and deep meditative experiences to be able to fully prove the Buddhist worldview to ourselves. The same is true of scientific views. You know, you might know the theories and you might know lots of research and you might look at your own kind of experience of living in a body, but how can you know for sure, in such a way that your behavior changes for the better or your outlook on life changes in some way? So this is all to say that these are big questions that have seemingly simple, straightforward answers in Buddhism, but that's not to say that the truth of them is going to land quickly. Let it play in ambiguity. Have kind of a creative and curious approach to this content, because if we go in just kind of taking it for granted that science is 100% right, or religion is 100% right, or spirituality is 100% right, we might miss an opportunity to go a level deeper with this content than we already are at. So just kind of sitting with that initial question, is the mind material or immaterial? Is the mind the brain? What comes to you right at first? Simple sentences, things you've read, experiences you've had. What arises? Does it matter if the brain is the mind? Does it matter if the mind is immaterial or material? That's another question. Does it even matter in terms of your everyday happiness and suffering? Maybe it comes into question when you feel death is coming. Maybe it comes into question when you're curious about when life begins. But then the rest of the time, you're just kind of like, oh, well, anyway, there's experience. Who knows where it came from? Doing my best. I'm at the whims of my moods. Sometimes I have control of them, sometimes I don't. Sometimes my gut biome is acting up and making me grumpy, or maybe I'm the one that's making me grumpy, or maybe the outside is making me grumpy. Anyway, I don't know, drink more water. You know, who knows what you do with these kind of information, right? But the question of how does an experience arise and how much control over the next moment of experience do we have? These are really important questions because all of us want to have more consistent contentment and more connection with other people. And hopefully that's all under the heading of how do we develop into the sort of people that are of deep and vast benefit to others. So the question of the mind is a really pivotal one in Buddhism, and understanding all of its inner workings really helps you understand where to put energy, where it's efficient, where it's inefficient, how to make strategies, and where to be patient with yourself and not push. Okay, so I'm going to keep going with some of the groundwork things. Yeah, so we're just going to hold this question and, you know, keep coming back to it. But the position of Buddhists is that the mind is not the brain. The mind uses the brain, but that's not the same thing. Okay, so you don't have to take on this position, but the position of all Buddhists is that the mind is not the brain. So whatever position we hold, that the mind is material or immaterial, in general, what we call consciousness is known to exist based on experience. So it doesn't necessarily need to be proved through reasoning. Nevertheless, there are many types of subtle mental states that must be proved through reasoning, at least initially, right? So we're going to kind of go along with probably the Buddha is not lying to us, probably the experience of great meditators is accurate, and we're going to need to prove that through reasoning initially, but eventually we'll be able to prove it experientially. Okay, so the mind uses the brain related to whichever rebirth one is born into, if that embodiment has a brain. So of course there are realms that are formless, or there are realms where there isn't an obvious brain. You know, think of a jellyfish, for example. So generally speaking, we can say the mind uses the brain if there's a brain there. But if there's no brain there, the mind still exists for all sentient beings. And so we're thinking about this six realms model in the Wheel of Life, this traditional picture to describe cyclic existence. So just blowing it up, these six realms are mental states that have a physical experience. So whether you accept the teachings literally or not, we can see that the way the mind's habits have an influence on how the environment is experienced. So your mood mandates how things seem to you, but also what you're habituated to really has an influence on how you connect to the world. So if we're to look at the literal teaching, we have upper realms and lower realms, right? The upper realms, for example, the God realm, which is very dominated by pride, the demigod realm dominated by jealousy, and the human realm dominated by desire. And these upper realms have, generally speaking, more happiness than suffering, or at least more baseline safety. Yeah, more baseline safety, more access to resources, more general contentment. And nevertheless, even though they're, quote, upper realms, they still have afflicted tendencies within them. So if we're to think about this in a less literal way, if we don't believe that there are these god and demigod realms, we could think of people who have such a strong habituation to pride and also have a lot of material wealth. And the way in which having pride and material wealth and a lot of resources can block compassion. Now, it's not necessary that it blocks compassion, but I think we do see this with people who have an abundance of wealth, not a regular level of wealth, but just huge, vast amounts of wealth, such that all of their basic needs are taken care of by other people, and that they don't necessarily have direct contact with people in coarse suffering states, with like homelessness, for example, or around people with severe mental health issues, when they're kind of protected from those everyday sufferings, there can be a sort of pride that arises that they feel almost entitled to the resources they've wound up having through countless causes and conditions. So just kind of sitting with like, have we experienced that ourselves in our life when things have been going really, really well? The tendency to separate ourselves from the suffering of others and to have a little bit of arrogance or haughtiness that kind of looks down on people who haven't gotten their act together materially. You know, like, why don't you just manage your investments better? Why don't you pay off your bills on time? Why have you let yourself have such debt? Why this, why that? And there's a sort of a judgmentalness that can come. And then the stock market crashes, as it always does, inevitably every once in a while. And suddenly you're less stable than you were. And that humility returns. And with it can come some real compassion for others. And you understand the impact of unstable resources. So having this kind of God realm experience, whether literally or in the human realm, doesn't necessarily make your mind better for the spiritual path. Do you know what I mean? Right. And so that's just one example. So, you know, kind of grain of salt with this particular teaching, but it is interesting to look at both the literal teaching as well as kind of the metaphoric teaching if we were to put it into the human realm. So we're talking about minds and mind habituations when we're talking about these six realms. So then the lower realms, we have the animal realm, which is dominated by ignorance. And not just ignorance, but a lot of fear, a lot of craving, you know, basically just trying to get food, trying to get a mate, trying to get safety. And there's just a certain level of education not accessible to animals. I think we can see that quite clearly. They can't study, right? And then we have hungry ghosts, which is kind of a broad category for any number of spirit realm beings, and their dominant energy is miserliness. So this is, if we were to put it in human context, a little bit like the mind of an addict. So someone who has a lot of craving, and even when that craving is fulfilled, it's never enough. And that deep, ravenous hunger for whatever the substance is just doesn't go away. So they're depicted as these beings with very large tummies and very tiny throats, and whatever resources they access, they can't digest. So whether it's metaphoric or in the human realm, this can really happen to us where we get dominated by a mind of miserliness, and craving is just like our default setting. And then we have the hell realms, which are realms dominated by hatred, and some of them are hot and some of them are cold, just like different forms of hatred can be very boiling, fiery anger, or very cold, withdrawn, sort of passive aggressive forms of anger. So when we're looking at these teachings of the Buddha, I think, the question becomes, what do you do with this information? If you see yourself in one of these six realms, obviously we're human beings, but do we see ourselves falling into a tendency related to one of these? And are we fated to stay there? And of course, from a Buddhist perspective, no, not at all. We actually can break the whole wheel. We can get out of this mess altogether. But naming the different habituations of the realms, I think, is very confronting, but very useful as well. I think some people who come into Asian thought have an idea of cyclic existence or reincarnation or samsara as being linear. Yeah, like you're just going to keep getting better and better, and every rebirth's going to be better, and you're just going to progress higher and higher and higher, and it's going to be kind of tidy. And next life will definitely be better. And from a Buddhist perspective, that's a misunderstanding. Yeah, you're going to go where your mind is habituated to go. So the old saying is, if you want to know what your past life was like, look at your current circumstances. If you want to know what your future life will be, look at the mind you're developing now. So that could be good news or bad news or mixed news, probably mostly mixed news for us. But it's not definite that you're going to keep getting human rebirths and higher just by waiting. Progress isn't passive. You have to be proactive in your developmental process of the mind. But the good news is that you can. If you're active, you can actually train the mind into incredible states, free from suffering, free from disturbing emotions, incredibly beneficial. But not just by waiting passively. Yeah, it's not a tidy stair step. So you could become very renowned, very stable, very well loved, but your inner habituation is so much negativity that the very next life you're in the lower realms. Quite possible. Or it could be that you're very destitute and things have been such a struggle and you've really been doing it tough your whole life. And the habituation has been to try and meet those circumstances well and to use them as fuel for the path. And your next life actually is much better, or any number of variations, right? So from a Buddhist perspective, cyclic existence, samsara, this reincarnation process, is not linear. Are there any questions so far or any thoughts that are arising so far? This is knowledge that a lot of you have, but it might be bringing up new questions or ideas. Yeah, Joe, go ahead.
First of all, looking at the choice of the six realms, none of them look very attractive, do they?
No, well said.
I'm like, oh. The other thing I wanted to, yeah, I've been misled. I want my money back. Sorry. The other thing I wanted to say is that perhaps you say it's it's not linear and we can look at the life we have now to try to deduce what our life was before, and we have the ability to, if we choose well, and think well with our minds, we can determine the kind of shape of our next life. Well, is it an idea in Buddhism that you perhaps don't judge either, that you perhaps don't think of it in terms of that's positive or that's negative, but rather look at it from a kind of non-judgmental way and kind of like maybe I'm better if I have a positive to go for. So I know that, messages throughout my life have been, oh, don't judge, don't judge. So I replace that with being curious. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
that's interesting. So I'm wondering whether um whether that's a thing in Buddhism, perhaps, just to think of, just not to assign a negative or a positive to an experience.
Yeah, it's a really important point because we would say kind of from a distance that the lower realms, we judge them as not ideal, right? We can make that judgment. They are not ideal for practicing the spiritual path because there's too much suffering, because there's too much ignorance, but they're also not fate and they're not forever. A human life, we could say that's ideal, but only in a certain context, only if the mind wants to grow, only if the conditions around you support that. So we make a judgment from a distance more in the sense of what is conducive or not conducive, as opposed to good or bad in a kind of pejorative way, because all of us have been in all of these realms countless times. We believe in beginningless time and beginningless rebirth. So the consciousness has been around from beginningless time. Time has been around beginninglessly. It's kind of it's a far out concept, but for us, it makes more sense than the idea that consciousness just popped out of nowhere from nothing. And we also don't believe in a creator deity in the same sense as a lot of Judeo-Christian beliefs. So what created mind was a previous moment of mind, a previous moment of mind, and a previous moment of mind. So it's a continuity of consciousness. It's a continuum of consciousness that develops certain characteristics and habit energies and karmas. And because of those collection of characteristics and habits, it expresses itself in the external environment in terms of how you perceive things. And that can sound a little bit esoteric, but then think about how different weather seems to you under the influence of a good mood or a bad mood, right? It's something as simple as that. If your mind is feeling uplifted and happy and it's raining, you think about, growth and fertility and abundance and green is coming and spring is coming, and you're kind of uplifted by the rain. If you're in a terrible mood, you think, oh, isn't that just the case again with the rain? And it makes you feel heavy and sedentary and kind of melancholy. In both cases, it's just rain, but the mind you bring to it colors your experience. So, what we want to do is then say, well, whatever I'm experiencing, let me decide to make it fuel for the path. Let me decide that whether this life is full of suffering, full of happiness, or a mixed bag, that whatever arises, I take it as fuel for my developmental process, as I use it for ways of widening pathways of empathy to be able to connect and understand others. So that's what we're trying to bring to it. So I wonder if, not being judgmental, but being curious, it's kind of more along that vibe of I'm curious to see what I can do with the conditions of my life, good or bad. I'm curious to see what I can work with and what I'm going to just need to be patient with for now. That for sure. And certainly we're not being judgmental towards beings in other realms, particularly lower realms, because we've been there too. Yeah, we're all the same in the sense that we all just want happiness and not suffering. We have similar types of consciousness, and they've either had conditions to develop or not, and everything in between. So we're not ever looking down at beings in other realms, definitely not using judgment in that way. Yeah. Yeah. Dana, is it?
Yes, it's Dana.
Yeah, nice to see.
When I've looked at this before, this is maybe getting in the weeds just a little bit, but it keeps popping up. Um, for lower realm beings, say like animals, but as in like insects, an ant, a creature like this, how do the causes and conditions come about for those creatures to reach higher realms?
Mm, right, because they're not getting a lot of work done in that
Well,
particular.
sure. They're not necessarily practicing a lot of Dharma and going on a spiritual path in the
Yeah,
few days that they're alive, you know.
And it's one of those rebirths where the idea is that if you die with a peaceful mind, then positive karma can arise and project your next rebirth. So all of us have tons of positive karma from past lives and tons of negative karma from past lives and tons of neutral karma from past lives. So too the insect. So they're not really relying on the work they've done in that tiny insect life. They die with a generally peaceful, unafflicted, not an angry mind like in a fight with another insect. Then the potential is there for them to ripen a positive seed for a positive rebirth. So this really gets into like how we care for our pets, like how to help them pass with a peaceful mind. We obviously don't believe in euthanasia of pets. We don't believe in killing anything, but certainly painkillers like morphine, certainly like palliative care for animals is really important. And trying to create conditions where they're not going to fight with other animals or be in distress, just to give them the best possible conditions for a positive seed to arise for their next rebirth. Yeah. 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 So yeah, a little in the weeds is okay. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. So, when we're looking at these, really the question becomes, is my mind trending in one of these ways? And is that problematic? And of course, definitely, as someone said earlier, all of it looks not so good. Indeed, that's the conclusion we want to come to. And that's part of the fuel for what's called renunciation, or the determination to be free from samsara, which is really renunciation of suffering and the causes of suffering, which assumes suffering can be ended, right? So, the first noble truth, there is suffering, and the second noble truth, it has a cause, karma and disturbing emotions. It's not the end of the story, right? Those first two noble truths would be very depressing if we left it there. But the third noble truth is there is a cessation to suffering, there is an end to suffering, and then the fourth, there is a path. So we want to remember there's a way out of this mess. The way out of this mess is to train the mind. How do you train the mind? You have to understand how the mind works. So there are two main reasons why we want to understand the nature of mind. One is because there's an intimate connection between mind and karma. So mind and karma is planted on the mental continuum and then ripens as experience, like those 6 realms. So we need to understand the relationship between those two so that we create better causes, right? The other is that our state of mind plays a crucial role in our experiences of happiness and suffering, which might sound self-evident, but sometimes we disempower ourselves by trying to too much change the outside world. Even though we know the outside world isn't the main thing mandating our experience, it's so easy to get lost in that, and to get lost in the experience of the senses and to try and get them to work for us, even though we know those are plans doomed to failure, or at least short-lived pleasure, not long-term. Nevertheless, we forget that our state of mind plays a crucial role in our experiences of happiness and suffering. So these are two main reasons why we study the mind. And to quote the Buddha, do not accept my dharma merely out of respect for me, but analyze and check it the way a goldsmith analyzes gold, by burning, cutting, and rubbing it. So this is just really an invitation to get clear on what the Buddhist worldview is, and then really deeply analyze, does it make sense and resonate for you? So as the Buddhist says, mind is the forerunner of all evil conditions. Mind is chief, and they are mind-made. If, with an impure mind, one speaks or acts, then pain follows one, even as the wheel follows the hoof of the ox. Mind is the forerunner of all good conditions. Mind is chief, and they are mind-made. If, with a pure mind, one speaks or acts, then happiness follows one, even as the shadow that never leaves. Okay, so right now, we're driven by afflictions, disturbing emotions, kleshas, right? But they're removable, and that's the really important piece. They're removable. So the main afflictions or disturbing emotions are the 3 poisons: attachment, ignorance, and anger. And they reinforce each other, as you see, one bites the tail of the other. They reinforce each other, but they are all removable, and that is a really important piece. So an affliction or disturbing emotion, klesha, nyomong, there's a lot of synonyms for these, but what we're talking about is the big category of that which disturbs the mind. When there is agitation in the mind, that when you have that upregulated kind of shaking feeling, that is very soon going to clarify itself into something like anger, attachment, ignorance, etc., etc., etc. Now, you could just be upset and it rolls through and finishes and doesn't particularly become problematic. But when there is that disturbance of mind, that's the really important time to engage mindfulness to check, what is it asking of us? Is it leading us in a way that we're not going to want in the future? So an affliction is really important to understand the nature of that which disturbs the mind. Then the nature of consciousness, and this is the big category: consciousness, awareness, cognition, mind, is that which is clear and knowing. So if you go to any Tibetan Buddhist center, particularly in our tradition, the Gelug tradition, and the Lama says, "What is consciousness?" they want you to say, "Clear and knowing." But what does that mean, clear and knowing? Right? This is the big umbrella category. So we're going to speak from the hierarchical schema of the 4 schools of Buddhist philosophy. These are the tenet schools some of you are familiar with: the Vaibhashika, Sautrantika, Yogacarya, and Madhyamika. So the Madhyamika school, particularly the Prasangika, the consequentialist school, which we belong to, is traditionally considered the highest because it critiques of essentialism are said to yield the most accurate account of what truly exists. So the wisdom side is evidently the most sophisticated. All right, you can take it or leave it. But the models of mind and cognition endorsed by the Madhyamaka or the middle way schools are drawn almost entirely from the 3 lower schools, namely the last 2. So this is just some context for some of you that are scholars. We're speaking from a lower school perspective when we talk about the mind because they're much clearer in their presentation. So to quote from Sutra, Manjushri, the mind is luminous clarity by nature, not afflicted by nature. Therefore, since all the afflictions are adventitious, all the afflictions are removable. Anything that is just luminous clarity by nature is unafflicted. So this statement, afflictions are adventitious and the mind is clear and knowing, will keep coming up in all forms of literature in the Buddhist tradition. So we're just going to unpack them a little bit. Okay, so the nature of cognition is stated to be awareness, and the nature of consciousness is said to be clear, luminous, and aware. Clear expresses the essential nature of consciousness. Yeah, the nature. And aware expresses its function. Clear expresses the essential nature of consciousness. Aware expresses its function. So clear also indicates that consciousness is beyond the nature of matter, which is characterized as tangible and obstructive. So it's not that, it's clear in nature. And that just as a reflection appears in a mirror, any internal or external object whatsoever, good or bad, pleasant or unpleasant, can appear in consciousness. Okay, so when we say clear, we don't necessarily mean accurate. The ability for accuracy is there, but we don't mean necessarily accurate, right? We're talking about that characteristic like a clear mountain lake. When it's still, when there's no wind, reflects the mountains and the clouds perfectly. Yeah, clear in that sense. But for us, we're like that beautiful clear mountain lake with lots of wind, and so the reflections are somewhat distorted. Yeah, that doesn't mean that the nature of water is distortion or the nature of mind is afflicted. It just means right now at present, there are features that obscure the clarity. So consciousness is luminous in that it illuminates objects. It's an interesting statement. Luminosity is a term you'll hear a lot in the Kagyu and Nyingma tradition, particularly. And what we feel like it means is the essential nature of consciousness is not contaminated by the stains of mental afflictions, such as attachment. So its nature is clear and luminous. and luminously clear in the sense that any internal or external object whatsoever, good or bad, pleasant or unpleasant, can appear in it. Just as sunlight or electric light illuminates forms, any external or internal phenomena can be illuminated by. That is, they appear to consciousness. It is what makes objects known or manifest, right? So objects are there, but what makes them accessible is consciousness coming into contact with them. So the illumination of sunlight or electric light and the luminous clarity that is essential nature of consciousness are utterly dissimilar, for sunlight and electric light illuminate only what is in their immediate vicinity and cannot illuminate other things. The way that consciousness illuminates objects is not restricted in that way. Okay, so the nature of consciousness is clear and knowing. Okay, clear and knowing is the nature of consciousness. So it's able to reflect, it's able to apprehend, and those characteristics can be developed into enlightenment or Buddhahood. Okay, so when we're talking about this big category consciousness, it's like, I always frame it as there's good news, there's bad news, there's neutral news, right? The good news is that we have Buddha nature. Buddha nature means that your mind can change. Why can your mind change? Because it lacks inherent existence, because it's impermanent, it changes moment to moment. If it was inherently existent or intrinsically existent, it would be as it is, causelessly. It wouldn't be in any way changeable either, right? It would have all sorts of problematic things that would interfere with growth. But already just in this life, you have seen growth in yourself, right? And that growth hasn't been something that just magically popped out of nowhere. It was learned, it was through experience, it was through any number of things. So when we're looking at that, we need to really sit with, do we believe change is possible? Do we believe fundamental shifts can happen? If so, why not exponentially? Right? So the good news is that we have Buddha nature or Buddha potential. The mind can change and develop into enlightenment. The bad news is that we have innate ignorance, but it's removable, so it's kind of good news, right? But the innate ignorance is always been together with our consciousness from beginningless time, and it's why we feel duality and disconnection, even when duality and disconnection aren't the reality. So this is something really interesting in our experience where we feel alone, independent, on our own, isolated, alienated, separate from each other, and like no one gets us fundamentally, or we don't get others fundamentally. The feeling that we're unrelated to the food that we eat, or the house we live in, or the clothes we wear, even though intellectually we kind of know better. Intellectually, we know there's this interconnection. It's not felt all the time. Particularly on a bad day, it's not felt, that interconnection. It's very easy to feel alone and isolated. And that is a symptom of innate ignorance. So you're not alone and you're not weird, but it is a problem that we have innate ignorance. And also it's removable. So that's the good news, right? The neutral news is just that the mind is clear and knowing. So that on its own isn't particularly good or bad. What we do to it is what makes it good or bad. Are you with me so far? Did I lose anybody? Or any bits to add from you senior students? This is the face of scanning the cubes.
I have a question,
Sure.
Venerable. Is it the nature of mind, which is clarity and luminosity, is it our Buddha nature? Is it the same?
It's, I mean, ish, right?
Because I had like in my imagination to help me understand better.
Yeah.
It was something that innate and inchangeable, like something that you have and you can go toward it to be revealed as a Buddha nature and to help other people when you have access to it 100%. Is it kind of correct or it's not at all?
The Buddha nature, really think of it in terms of the potential of mind. So this very mind you have will become a Buddha, right? This very mind you have right now, when you purify negative karma, when you purify those seeds of suffering, and when you develop and build merit and develop qualities and characteristics to their utmost extent, that very mind will become a Buddha mind. It will become enlightened. So the clear and knowing nature of the mind, it's just its relative characteristic. Its ultimate nature is its lack of inherent existence. And its lack of inherent existence is what facilitates the growth or what allows for that potentiality to be developed. So you can say roughly, consciousness is Buddha nature. You could say that very casually. It's not precise, but you know, I know what you mean. And it's going the right direction, so good enough for now.
Okay.
It's going
I
the
let
right.
it be for the moment. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so really think of the mind's potential as your Buddha nature. Yeah, your mind's potential. Yeah, other thoughts? Okay. Oh, one more. Sorry, yeah, Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, me again. So I think it's fantastic that we have the potential to change. That's
Right.
all I have to say.
You're here. You're here, right? Yeah, G, do you have your hand raised? Let's see. No, okay. All right, circle back if it comes up. Okay, so kind of broadening, where does consciousness live when we're talking about kind of everything that exists in the whole universe? You know, where are we placing consciousness? And fortunately, it's a short list when we break down phenomena into categories in Buddhism. But as chance would have it, we do have a list, right? It's a short list. But if you think, generally speaking, everything that exists is either permanent or impermanent. Okay, something that changes moment to moment is impermanent. Something that doesn't undergo momentary change is permanent. So something that's static, right? Not necessarily eternal, but something that doesn't undergo momentary change is permanent. Impermanent phenomena are the main thing that we're working with in our daily life. They're the main category of our experience. So that gets divided into form, consciousness, and non-associated composites, right? So things that change moment to moment are form, like the body or any kind of matter, like a stone. Consciousness, what we spoke about, that which is clear and knowing. And non-associated composites are things that are neither form nor consciousness because they're labeled in dependence upon both. For example, a person, right? A person is labeled in dependence upon form, the body, and consciousness, the mind. So a person is not form or consciousness. It's labeled in dependence upon both. So it's a non-associated composite. That category doesn't really matter in this particular class, but good to know it exists. So when we're talking about consciousness, there's a lot of different frameworks. The framework we're going to look at today is minds and mental factors. So if we were to subdivide characteristics of consciousness, we could talk about main minds or primary consciousnesses on one side and mental factors, states of mind, on the other. Okay, so when we're talking about main minds and mental factors, this is a little bit like that sky and clouds meditation a lot of you will have done, right? Have you ever done a meditation and the meditator says, okay, now move your focus away from the clouds to the vast sky-like nature of the mind? You know that one? Yeah, it's a classic. I recommend it. But what they're really saying is stop getting lost in your thoughts. Try to connect more with the reflective aspect. So you're not getting rid of thoughts, but you're turning down the volume of your attention on them. Yeah, and you're kind of shifting gears into that expansive, spacious characteristic, which is also always present. And the reason we use this sky analogy is because it really is like the vast blue sky is main mind, and states of mind very much are like weather in that they pull focus, right? Or clouds, they pull focus because they're moving, they're interesting, they're dynamic. So normally we're lost in thought, we're lost in clouds. But what if you were to consciously shift your attention to the big, vast blue? So this is what we're working on in a clarity of mind meditation, but just talking about minds and mental factors. It's not like one is in one place and the other is in another. Yeah, main minds and mental factors are both just characteristics of consciousness. They're both just functions of the mind. But what primary consciousnesses do, this is like eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, right? There's 6 primary consciousnesses. And one of them is dominant at a time. It might seem like you're seeing at the same time as hearing, right? It seems like you're seeing at the same time as hearing, but actually you're alternating very, very quickly. Yeah. And it might seem that you have a taste function happening continuously, but probably you're not really engaged with your tongue consciousness unless you're eating or thinking about it, right? So if you were to stop and think, what's the taste on my tongue? You've engaged it, but otherwise it's just kind of a passive background experience, like an inattentive awareness. Yeah. So primary consciousnesses, what they're doing is just holding objects and reflecting them. They don't have anything to say about if they're good or they're bad, or what to do with them, to move towards or away. They're just reflective. And that characteristic of the mind is kind of naturally peaceful, naturally undisturbed. The problem, or the good news, depending on the day or the moment, is that the mental factors come together with the main minds. And you always have all sorts of mental factors present with any main mind. And what they do is describe your experience to you. Yeah, they describe what you see, they describe what you hear, either in words or impressions, doesn't necessarily have to be words. They also move your mind towards or away, internal or external things, or they hold your attention on one thing for any length of time. There's their movement, right? So those are happening simultaneously. And what we want to do is to start manufacturing and encouraging and inviting positive mental factors to color our whole mental experience. So when I teach this to like little kids, I'll just hold a glass of water and say, okay, this water is like your mind. And then you put a little drop of food coloring in. See how the food coloring takes over the whole water. That's like what happens to your mind when you have love. Now the whole thing is love, right? Like if you were to teach a little kid, yeah. But it really helps even for adults, because if you think about it, some mental factors, some states of mind, when they're invited into the mix, they really color everything else. Like when love is present, the way people appear to you is pleasant. Have you noticed this, right? If someone in front of you is someone that you love, whether they're conventionally attractive or not, no longer matters. You find them beautiful if you love them. Yeah, they might have like a mole and you just love that mole, and they might have some crinkly eye wrinkles and you love their crinkly eye wrinkles, and they might have a kind of a lopsided smile and you find that really endearing, right? Like it's just a face, right? But because you love them, it's beautiful to you. Have you had this experience, right? Especially when love is activated and up. Yeah. And similarly, like when you're really angry, it could be at the same exact person, the same face. They're unattractive to you. You don't like the sight of them. You don't like the sound of their voice. Even their smell is repellent to you when anger is up. Have you noticed this? It sort of takes over your experience, yeah? So what we're trying to do is get a little bit more control over which mental factors are driving, and understand that they have that ability to kind of take over your whole experience, even ones that aren't specifically ones you want them to take over. Thoughts? True? Does it feel true? Yeah. It's a fascinating one. Yeah. It really can be interesting. Yeah, G, go ahead.
Yeah, intention comes up for me when you talk this way. You
Yep.
know, how does intention, I have an intention to love, I have an intention, you know, there's a will behind this. Can you elaborate on that concept?
I sure can. Intention from a Buddhist perspective is that which moves the mind away or towards and is an omnipresent mental factor. It's there all the time. And so when we talk about intention colloquially, intention is intentional, right? You mean to do something, you have will and volition, you decide to intentionally. In Buddhism, intention is always present, but sometimes it's passive and sometimes it's active. So what we do at the beginning of class when we set our motivation, that's sort of taking the reins of intention and saying, go this way. Yeah. Setting the motivation is like organizing intention. You saying to yourself, the reason I'm doing this is in order to develop my mind so that I can be of greatest benefit to all sentient beings. So then the mind is directed in a conscious way. But if you didn't do that, intention would still be present. It would just be a little bit less intentional, if that makes sense. Okay. So intention is an interesting one, but it is also where karma is created. Yeah, karma is created through intention, and how strong the karma is depends on how strong the intention is and whether you see it through or not, and whether other accompanying factors as well. So intention is a huge important part of our experience, and it's present all the time. So the question becomes, how often do we take the reins of intention and make it something that we want on purpose and give it that strength that it can have? Yeah. Okay. So if we're going to break down main minds and mental factors, so main minds or primary consciousnesses, those are synonymous. As I mentioned, there are the 5 that are sensorial and then the 6th, which is mental. Okay, and these are all formless, right? These are all clarity and awareness. They're all just characteristics of consciousness. And then if we switch over and look at the weather bits, right? We were looking at the sky bit, now we're looking at the weather bits, or the cloud bits, mental factors or states of mind. You could say thoughts, although it's kind of a broader category than that. You could say thoughts and emotions are kind of under the mental factors category, but it's kind of broader than that. There are 51 that we talk about in this particular teaching, which you can divide into 6 categories. So the first category is the 5 omnipresent mental factors, which I just referenced, intention being one of them. And then you have the 5 object ascertaining mental factors, which aren't always there, but are often engaged in things like meditation or when you're doing something that requires a lot of focus. And then you have 11 virtuous or positive mental factors, and 6 root delusions and 20 secondary afflictions, and 4 variable. So the 4 variable are variable because they could be positive or negative depending on what other mental factors are present. Okay, so this first set is probably the most important set to understand. The 5 elements essential to any state of consciousness, however gross or subtle they may be, they constitute the inherent makeup of cognition, without which it could not function, these 5 omnipresent mental factors. So they're here all the time. In every moment, you have these 5 at least, but usually more as well. So you always have feeling, discernment, intention, contact, and attention. Yeah, they accompany all 6 primary consciousnesses. Okay, so feeling isn't emotion. Yeah, we're not talking about emotion colloquially. Feeling in Buddhism, feeling experiences the results of our past actions. So feeling is where old karma is ripening. Old karma ripens in any number of places, but feeling is the main kind of place where you feel it most like palpably present. So it's what experiences. Yeah, so positive, negative, neutral, that arising, that's feeling. Discernment, it apprehends, differentiates, and identifies objects. So not necessarily in words, you know, animals have discernment as well, but it's like, oh, this is solid, oh, this is space. You know that whether you have words for that or not, right? So it recognizes. Intention is karma. It is action. And it's what moves the mind. Attention or mental engagement focuses the mind or holds. Contact is the cause of feeling. It connects. So contact connects the outside world with the inside world, roughly speaking. It's when your sense consciousnesses and your sense powers meet an object, or internally in meditation, mental objects. So these 5 are always happening every single second of every single day. And they're always together in the retinue of whatever primary consciousness is dominant. Okay. So before we do anything more, do you have any questions about those 5 or any thoughts about those 5? 2 of them might be familiar to you if you know the list of the 5 skandhas or the 5 aggregates, right? Feeling and discrimination are similar feeling and discrimination in those contexts. Yes, the group of 3, David, Aaron, Terry.
So can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. So you mentioned those 5 that we just went over, and they're happening all the time, but contact you had as number 5, but that was giving the rise to feeling. So there's not necessarily an order of operations there. It's not like a chronology with them.
It's like they all interact with one another. They're all happening simultaneously. But if you were to like grab one, you could see how it's affecting the others. And it seems like contact would be the place to start. But you're forever coming into contact with things, responding to them, moving towards other things, coming into contact with those. That's all happening simultaneously. And they're all interacting with one another. If that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, and it's a really helpful way of unpacking your experience of consciousness. Actually, if you're thinking about just watching the mind play out, you're just having a quiet moment by yourself and you think, why do I think that? Whatever that is. Why do I think that? It's like, I was feeling this and I was focused on that and I moved towards this, which engaged me with it. Oh, right. I can't really catch the tail of it. Then you kind of get lost down the rabbit hole. It's one of these things that becomes also very interesting if you look at trying to, go to therapy, and psychotherapy can be so useful, such an effective tool for development, for healing. And also if you're trying to get to the bottom of the rabbit hole of why am I like this, you're gonna fail in therapy because you'll never get to the bottom of it, right? You'll be like, oh, it's my family of origin. Oh, their family of origin. Oh, all of my ancestors from beginningless time. Oh, wait, oh no, mitochondrial Eve. Oh God, you'll never get to the bottom of it. So it's like at some point you have to just call it and be like, I think people did the best they could with what they had, and some of them were confused and did the wrong thing. Oh, that's all of us. Okay. Let's find a strategy now to work with that. But it does help to go to therapy long enough to see certain patterns and causations and things that are relative to this life can be so helpful. But even just looking at the 5 omnipresent mental factors, it is so hard to say, why did you decide to move your head from one direction to another? Just one tiny choice. Was it made independently? Was it made from one thing only? Let alone all the giant choices and big movements of our life. It's an interesting one to sit with, and it very much helps if you're doing meditations on dependent arising. Yeah, Michael, go ahead.
What occurred to me as you were speaking is our ability to identify why we made that choice versus our probably the immediate response would be to come up with some answer that sounds rational, but possibly has nothing to do with why you made that choice. So you've got both these things heating, and oh my gosh, totally confusing.
Who's driving the bus?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. No, and that's the conclusion to come to is, oh, right. We are complex little creatures. And it immediately can soften a certain type of fragility or defensiveness or criticism that you might have towards anyone or anything, including yourself, because you realize even the smallest choice was not made alone, causelessly. You know, you realize so many causes and conditions came together for absolutely everything. Now, what do? Let's just try and add in more compassion, right? That's the conclusion. Add in more compassion, add in more compassion, and get that into the mix and see if we can start bringing some functionality to our situation and more everyday contentment. Yeah, it becomes more strategic. So in a way, studying the mind can make you feel like you have less power, but actually it winds up making you feel much more strategic about where power is actually present. Because right now, what we're doing is just rotating through our senses, trying to get them to entertain us. And sometimes in a quiet moment, we're with our mental primary consciousness, or maybe just in sleep. But really what we're kind of doing is like try to watch something or read something until we're bored of it, try and listen to something or talk until we're bored of it, eat something until we're bored of it, get a tactile physical sensation until we're bored of it. And we're just rotating through our senses, trying to get some peace of mind. And we kind of do a lot of it without really thinking about it, just kind of autopilot chasing some sort of peace. And it's so human and so natural. But if you kind of pause and see that you're doing that, you can then start to take the power back and ask, what are the actual causes of happiness? And how do I orchestrate those much more strategically? And what is actually of benefit to others and not just symptoms relief or not just kind of taking the edge off? You know, yes, of course I can feed people. That's a wonderful thing to do. But then what? You know, offering food could be your practice, or it could just be a stopgap to help people not suffer for a second. You know, the form doesn't really matter, but the mind you bring to it is everything. So whether you're, you know, in a helping profession like a doctor, or you're someone who's in a more kind of commercial industry, I don't know, you work for Samsonite, you're selling suitcases, any of it can be a format for the spiritual path or not. It depends on the mind you're bringing to it. Are you looking for ways to maintain peace and stability, to access more and more levels of kindness and clarity? You know, or are you giving in to those old habits of just trying to get the senses to make you entertained? So self-directed evolution is not something you're doing all by yourself, but if you can get intention together with something like compassion, the rest of it will synchronize so much better, and it will also prevent those negative states of mind from getting a foothold. Yeah, other thoughts about those 5 omnipresent mental factors. They really are the most important of the list to understand. Yeah, Joel, go ahead.
I'd like to ask, where would intuition fit in order, or does it not?
I mean, we don't have that word in the list, but we have that experience described. Yeah. So, you know, if you think about intuition, intuition is kind of in a way pattern recognition, but very subtle pattern recognition that you might not have been able to articulate to yourself. You know, like you get an uneasy feeling or you get drawn towards happy feeling. You know, what is that about? You know, like, oh, it's my gut biome. Oh, it's my trauma. Oh, it's my, you know, it could be a million things right on the surface. But what is it really that's making you think this is the right thing to do or avoid that at all costs? From a Buddhist perspective, if that's coming from a place of really aversion energy or attachment energy, we want to be cautious and not necessarily believe that it's true intuition wisdom. But if it's coming from a place of deep calm and clarity, it's worth really leaning into and thinking there's some very subtle pattern recognition, maybe even from previous lives, that right now I'm not able to fully articulate, but I can feel the truth of it. So if it's coming from a place of deep calm, it's more likely to be accurate. If it's coming from a place of deep agitation, it might not be. which is not to say survival instinct, right? Like survival instinct might be quite agitated, like get out of there now, like don't overthink it, like stop at a stop sign, you know, play dead if you see a bear, you know, don't run from the bear, right? Beat up the mountain lion, I don't know. You know, like survival instinct is a whole other thing, and that might have a level of agitation. But if it's something about a decision and your intuition is saying, don't do this, but it's coming from a really agitated place, wait until there's calm and then check again if it feels as true. And if it does, then by all means. So, you know, intuition from a Buddhist perspective, it's like an educated guess, but it's an educated guess coming from certain amounts of content that you might not be completely able to access in a verbal way. It might be coming from not quite remembered memories. Do you know what I mean? Like when you meet someone and you're really like, yeah, this person's going to be my friend, and they turn out to be, and you're like friends for life. It's like there's some sort of recognition happening there. There's some sort of connection happening, but it's hard to put it into words because then you just sound kind of woo-woo. But there was a real wisdom there that was directing that. We talk about those sorts of things, and we do talk about clairvoyance in Buddhism, which is basically the result of a very, very stable meditation practice, above and beyond what we would call calm abiding or special calm abiding and special insight combined. In particular, when you're able to develop these meditative abilities, a natural result of that is deeper and deeper levels of clairvoyance, so they say. Right, we'll have to see. But we also talk about clairvoyance in other realms, like the vision of a hawk, for example, is much superior to our vision. They're able to see a lot further away. In Buddhism, we would call that a form of clairvoyance, but to us, that sounds like weird. We're like, that's just a natural characteristic of that body that they can see that way. But far seeing is, you know, on the list of clairvoyances. So I don't know if that answers your question about intuition, but certainly there are experiences discussed in Buddhism that are, you know, trust your immediate experience and also pause if that's your immediate knee-jerk reaction, and how to know the difference. That's discussed a lot. Yeah. Yeah. All right, so let's have like a 5-minute break and then we'll do a meditation. Okay, let's see you in 5 minutes. Okay. So get yourself a nice meditation posture, nice straight back. And just take a few intentional breaths, getting yourself firmly focused into your body. And as you focus on the body, gently scan through from the crown of your head down to the tip of your toes, allowing any tension to settle and release. Just being a compassionate witness to your own physical experience. And then with the sound of the bell, shift your focus to the breath. Just the breath. Simple and direct. Whatever thoughts arise, just choosing not to follow them, choosing not to suppress them. Just let them go. When the breath is shallow, you simply know that it's shallow. When it's deep, you simply know that it's deep. No breathing in and no breathing out. Just let that knowing be the main experience of your focus. Just the breath. And then see if you can keep that experience of knowing, but let go of the object, the breath, and just be with that clear and knowing, spacious consciousness. That experience of knowing. That sky-like nature. Thoughts and emotions, mental factors, coming and going like clouds, choosing not to follow them. Sky, not the clouds. And if you feel yourself getting lost in thought, just gently disengage and come back to that knowing aspect. Reflective, spacious but not spacey. Trying not to anticipate or plan. Trying not to reminisce. Just stay present with that reflective aspect of the main mental consciousness. Reflective like a mountain lake, free from wind, like a mirror reflecting the objects. Let your focus sit in that natural peace, not needing to make anything happen. And if there's distraction, you simply notice it and come back to that reflective focus. Non-reactive. And as the mind starts to settle, choose to invite a very specific type of weather, very specific mental factors, the very thoughts that we began with. And imagine inviting into your mind the four immeasurable thoughts. Thinking, may all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. Let your mind mix with love. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. Let your mind mix with compassion. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. Let your mind mix with joy. And may all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from desire for friends and hatred for enemies. Let your mind mix with equanimity. And think that all of these positive qualities, love, compassion, joy, and equanimity, have already been perfected by countless Buddhas before us, and that we're developing into that same enlightened state through training the mind. Think that the founder of this particular round of Buddhism, Shakyamuni Buddha, appears in the space in front, embodying all of those qualities and characteristics. He looks directly at you and all sentient beings. Golden in color, one face and two arms. Smiling, holding you and all sentient beings in his gaze. From his heart comes radiant golden light, flowing in and through you, ripening your own Buddha nature, bringing support, inspiration, stability. Waves of golden light from the Buddha to you. And together with that visualization, add the mantra. Taya tai hom mune mune maha munae so ha. Taya ta hom mune mune maha munae so ha. Taya ta om mune mune maha munae so. You can continue the mantra under your breath, together with the visualization. Taya ta om mune mune. Taya ta om mune mune maha munae so. And then think that the Buddha dissolves into light and absorbs into you, blessing your body, speech, and mind. And dedicate all of the merit of this class. Janchu semcho rinpoche, ma ke panam ke gyuji, ke pa nyamba me pa yang, gone gondu pelwa sho, toni dawa rinpoche, ma ke panam ke gyuji, ke pa nyamba me pa yang, gone gondu pelwa sho. Okay, so you can relax your attention. And next time we'll do some more meditation and some more of the mental factors, and we'll also shift gears and look at some other ways of looking at the mind. But if there's things that you would particularly like to unpack or focus on, please do bring them up, and we can also tweak the curriculum to go where you have particular areas of interest. So have a think about that as well. And the slides from today will be made available if you'd like them. So I'll pass those on to the folks at Ocean of Compassion. And thank you so much, guys, for hosting. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Venerable.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Bay.
Okay.
Thank you, Venerable Yönten.
Thank you.
Good night.
Hey.
Night.
Thank you so much.